Greetings and welcome to the 193rd session of the online Optom Learning Series OOLS. And for today's session, first of all, we would like to thank all our accreditators and our education support by SEG University as well as Cooper Vision. And to represent Cooper Vision, we also have a representative who will be taking us through a little bit about the company and the lenses in the later half of the presentation. But for the main talk, we have Professor Mark Bullimore. And Professor Bullimore, again, needs no introduction. He has been onto the platform a couple of times. He has done a session with us on myopia as well. So first of all, those who have not watched or viewed the session, I would request you to go on to that session onto our YouTube channel, as well as his website. I know he always puts into this all of the latest evidence and research about myopia onto his website, which is on the screen, bulls2020.com, and he's reachable onto his social media channels as well. He is an internationally renowned scientist, speaker, as well as educator based in Boulder, Colorado. He received his optometry degree and PhD in vision science from the Aston University in Birmingham, England. And then he spent most of his career at the Ohio State University and the University of California at Berkeley. Currently, he's an adjunct professor at the University of Houston. He has written a number of papers, and most importantly, he has also been the editor and reviewer for various journals as well. And his work has resulted in the approval of, amongst many others, but most importantly, the Paragon CRT lenses, the Alcon iLux, and also the Cooper Vision's MySight lenses for FDA approval. So welcome, Prof, again onto the platform, and take us through your thoughts about what is myopia management, and does ethnicity and race have an important thing to be taken into consideration? So welcome, and let me hand the screen time to you.
All right. Thanks for the kind introduction. Let me start by reminding everybody that I do work for a number of companies, large and small, some of which you recognize here, and a number of them have an interest in myopia control. I also have a couple of small companies of my own, but neither have anything to do with myopia. So, as our host said, I began my career in the UK. That was me when I was entering optometry school at the age of 18. And you see, I haven't changed at all. And that was that. I graduated in 83. And then, as you were told, I spent most of my career at the University of California, Berkeley, which is in the top left there. You can see San Francisco across the bay. And then after that, 15 years at the Ohio State University. And you can see me with about 100,000 of my closest friends there at a football game. But the last 11, 12 years, I've been in Colorado, and that's the view from our deck. And until recently, I was a resident alien. And you can see that was my first green card on the right there. And even though it's called a green card, it was in fact pink. So life in Colorado is always interesting, with lots of wildlife to see, often close to the house. And we've already had a fair amount of snow this season. And it's 7 a.m. in Colorado. So if you see me drinking, you can be sure it's coffee that I'm consuming this morning. Now, I often get asked why I moved to Colorado, and there are a number of potential reasons, of course. This isn't a poll question. You can just try and figure out amongst yourself whether you know the right answer or not. But the big news for me is about 10 days ago, I actually finally completed my citizenship process. So I'm now actually an American citizen. So that's what my certificate looks like. Now, again, you were directed to my website, and you don't have to register there. You don't have to, no one's going to try and sell you anything. The main reason I have a website is just for sort of parking my my CV and my resume and materials. But if you go to the front page of the website, you will see a link to recommended reading on myopia management. You click on that, and it'll take you to this page, which has a number of papers that I'll either refer to in this lecture or in other lectures, but a list of papers that I think are important to build up your knowledge on myopia management or myopia control. So you can see there at the bottom, there's a couple important papers from Cooper Vision on the MiSight lens and myopia control. So let's ask this rhetorical question: why myopia? Why now? Because I showed you on the earlier slide when I was at optometry school back in about 40 years ago, we regarded myopia as a purely benign condition. It was something that we regarded as an inconvenience, but we were happy to correct it with spectacles, contact lenses, and of course, more recently, various refractive surgery procedures. But our perspective has changed, certainly over the last decade, and there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, myopia is increasing in its prevalence. It's already reached epidemic levels in the Far East of Asia, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that part of the world in today's talk. We also have a better understanding of the role that myopia plays in myopia management. We know that myopia is associated with an increased risk of a number of diseases like primary open-angle glaucoma, retinal detachment, but most importantly, myopic maculopathy. And these combined to actually increase the risk of visual impairment with every diopter of myopia. So with every diopter of myopia, we estimate that there's about a 30% increase in the risk of visual impairment later in life. So it's a big public health issue. And of course, finally, we now have the ability to do something about it. We have excellent products available to us, spectacles, contact lenses, in some cases, pharmaceutical options. So these are all the sort of four main categories of options that we have for slowing myopia progression. And used correctly and with the right design, the right choice of products, we can make significant benefits by slowing the progression of myopia in our young patients. But the question I really want to focus on today is, does treatment efficacy vary with race? So a lot of the studies that have resulted in the development and approval, regulatory approval of some of our options have been conducted on a fairly limited ethnic sample. So we'll talk about that, because the important question I get asked all the time is, can I extrapolate the myopia control efficacy results from a study in one country, usually in East Asia, China, to the patients that I see in my practice? And that's what we're going to talk about in today's session. Now, before we start talking about myopia control efficacy, I want to focus on a number of differences that exist between East Asian children, and I'm using European Union children as the sort of the comparison here, but North America, South Asia, you could use, the questions apply to the same. There are a number of differences, but there are also a number of similarities, and I'm going to highlight these so we have a good basis of knowledge when we start thinking about how myopia control might work the same or differently in different populations. So the first obvious difference I've already mentioned. The prevalence of myopia is much higher in East Asian countries like Korea, Japan, Singapore, Hong Kong. But there's a similarity in so much that myopia prevalence is increasing in all countries, with a few notable exceptions. So if we pay attention to the seminal paper from a few years ago that projected the prevalence of myopia through the year 2050, we come up with that soundbite that everybody uses. That is that by the middle of the century, by the year 2050, half of the population of the world will be nearsighted, myopic. And also about 10% will have myopia of 5 diopters or worse. But as I said, you can see when you compare different regions from this paper, you can see that countries in the East and Southeast Asia already have prevalences approaching 50%, whereas parts of North America and Europe are lagging behind. But if we wind the clock forward 50 years and see what our projections are, we can see that everywhere is going to be a lot higher. But the disparity between East Asia and the West is going to be reduced. So that's something to bear in mind when we think about the need for myopia control. Now, an important similarity is that in all cases, regardless of race, regardless of nationality, the vast majority of child myopia or juvenile onset myopia is a result of axial elongation. And of course, the progression of myopia is very closely related to ongoing axial elongation. But the important thing to note here is that the ratio of myopia progression to axial elongation is really independent of ethnicity. So we presented some data last year at the ARVO meeting where we had done a systematic review of studies, and we had identified 67 studies with 86 different subpopulations. And within those, there are 167 different evaluations of the relationship between progression in diopters and elongation in millimeters. So we presented this this poster, but I just want to zoom in on this particular on the data. And what I'm showing you here is the ratio between myopia progression in diopters and axial elongation in millimeters as a function of the child's age. And what you can see on average, the mean ratio is around about 2. That's a little lower than perhaps you might expect based on our learnings at in optometry school. Because if you think about purely from an optical basis and think about how much diopters would be produced by a millimeter longer eye, you end up with something that's closer to perhaps 2.3, 2.5. The reason it's a little bit lower here is we're talking about progression, and there's probably a little bit of compensation of the crystalline lens in this process. So even though the eye is growing, the crystalline lens is probably flattening, and that brings the ratio down to around about 2. But the important thing to know here is that, first of all, that number, that ratio seems to be unaffected by age in this particular age group. And also it's unaffected by race. So we've color-coded the different ethnicities here. And the blue dots represent entirely white individuals, white children. The red dots represent East Asian children. And any color in between, any sort of deeper red or purple, is a study where there's a blend or a mix of races, as you often see in studies in North America. So there doesn't seem to be any fundamental difference here in between East Asian eyes and other eyes around the world. Another important similarity is the relation between eye disease and the degree of myopia appears to be the same. And I spoke earlier about the fact that increased levels of myopia are associated with increased prevalence of eye disease. And these are really the first data set that I published with my friend and colleague Noel Brennan, and we were looking at the prevalence of myopic maculopathy in 5 very large epidemiological studies. These were conducted across different continents, and they represent over 20,000 patients. Now, what we did is we plotted the prevalence of myopic maculopathy as a function of the level of myopia. And we converted that into a logarithmic scale. And when we did that, we were really quite surprised to see that the 5 studies all gave us lines with a very, very similar trajectory. And in fact, the average slope of those lines is 1.67. So what that means is that for every additional diopter of myopia, there's a 67% increase in the risk or the prevalence of myopic maculopathy. Now, we extended that work in a subsequent paper. This is a paper that's probably worth you reading, and you can find it on my website. This talks about both the risks and benefits of myopia control. But in that paper, we identified some additional studies of the relationship between the degree of myopia and the prevalence of myopia, the prevalence of myopic maculopathy. And what we found is, again, the average ratio was around about 1.6. But what I've plotted here is for those 9 studies, the increase in prevalence of myopic maculopathy for every diopter. And I've colored the bars by whether they're these are studies in East Asians, or whether they're studies in other parts of the world, be it Europe or Australia. And what you can see is that there doesn't seem to be any difference overall between the data from East Asia and the data from other countries. There's actually one study here, the one that's, where are we? I'm going backwards, sorry. There's one study here on Chinese Americans in Los Angeles where they actually, my slides have got a mind of their own here. So study of Chinese Americans, again, predominantly East Asian descent, but living in the US. And those data fall right in the middle of all the other studies. So there doesn't seem to be any difference there. Again, in that paper, we explored the risks or the ratio in other diseases. So in this particular graph here, I'm plotting the prevalence of open-angle glaucoma, again on a logarithmic scale, as a function of different levels of myopia. And you can see here we've got studies of Chinese individuals, South Korea, but we've also got a couple of studies from the US. And again, those lines seem to be remarkably parallel, and the average slope of those lines is around about 1.2. So again, what does that mean? Every diopter of myopia is associated with a 20% increased risk of primary open-angle glaucoma. And that ratio or that increased risk seems to be independent of the race of the patients. Now, you might say, well, those lines seem to be spaced out very differently here in the vertical direction. Well, that's because these studies often use different criteria for the diagnosis of myopia, be it intraocular pressure, be it visual fields, be it optic nerve evaluation. And then here's another example. We've got 2 studies from the Far East and 2 studies from the US. And we're looking here at the prevalence of posterior subcapsular cataract. That's the only kind of cataract whose onset is related to the degree of myopia. Obviously, nuclear cataract is associated with myopia, but there it's the cataract that's causing the myopia. Here in these data, it's the myopia that's associated with an increased risk of the cataract. And again, what you can see overall is the slope of these lines is about 1.2. So again, each diopter of myopia is associated with an increased risk of posterior subcapsular cataract of around 20% per diopter. So let's get back to a difference. We also know from a lot of data that the progression of myopia is faster in East Asian children than it is in European or Indian or indeed North American children. However, there's a similarity in so much that both groups show a similar exponential slowing with age. So let's talk about age first of all. What you can see here are data from the COMET study, the Correction of Myopia Evaluation Trial. So this was a randomized clinical trial of progressive addition spectacle lenses on a large group of children. But what they're showing on the right, regardless of the mode of correction, they're showing the 3-year progression of myopia as a function of different ages of children. So what you can see, the lower dark blue line, you can see in the 6 and 7-year-olds, the subjects who were recruited initially at the age of 6 or 7, over the 3 years of the study, their myopia increased by around about 2¼ diopters. If you look at the light blue and yellow bars, lines at the top of the graph, those are 10 and 11-year-olds, you can see that the average progression in those age children is closer to 1 diopter. So there's a clear dependence on age of the rate of progression of myopia. So when somebody says a normal rate of progression is ½ diopter, that's really misleading, because the normal rate of progression is very much dependent on the underlying, on the age of the underlying subjects. So ethnicity also plays a role. So these are some data from the Brian Holden Vision Institute some years ago, and they looked at a number of studies on Asians, East Asian children, and compared them to children of European descent. And you can see on this graph on the right that the East Asian children progress around about 30 to 40% faster. And that's a hallmark of myopia progression. Now, we've recently, again, looked at the issue, but this time looking at annual axial elongation, and looked at that in East Asian myopic children, and also in children who are not East Asian. So this is predominantly European and North American children, but the Indian and South Asian children behave the same way. And what you can see here, these are just myopic children. You can see that the East Asian rate of progression or rate of axial elongation is always faster than the non-East Asian children. But both lines show a gradual exponential slowing of age. And in fact, a nice thing to remember is that you would expect the rate of elongation to decrease by about 15% per year. So over 4 years, the rate of axial elongation should halve. So let's get back to our original question here. Does treatment effect vary with age? And can I extrapolate data from East Asian studies to my patients? But before we dive into the data, I want to sort of give you my perspective on how we should be evaluating myopia efficacy. We live in an evidence-based world, and we rely most heavily on randomized clinical trials to evaluate the efficacy of an intervention, whether it's a medication to lower blood pressure, whether it's a drug to treat breast cancer. We rely on randomized clinical trials to produce a definitive answer on whether a treatment works or not. And in the case of myopia, we like to see at least 2 years of data for reasons I'll show you in a minute. We also like to see masking. We call it masking and not blinding. That's not a good word to use in the eye field. And ideally, we would like to have both the children who are being treated masked to the treatment they're receiving, which of course we can do fairly easily if we're doing a soft contact lens trial. but it's not so easy if you're doing orthokeratology. And we also like to see the examiners who are making the critical measurements in the trial also masked to the treatment. That way we can reduce bias. Now, we can obviously measure myopia progression in two different ways. We can either measure refractive error, or we can also measure axial length. And ideally, we like to see both of those measures made in a randomized clinical trial, or indeed any study of myopia progression. With regard to refractive error, autorefraction is the best way to do this, because, again, it's objective and it doesn't have the biases associated with subjective refraction. It's also important that we cycloplegia our subjects so that we can get, again, a more repeatable estimate. In terms of axial length, we tend to rely now on these very sophisticated and precise optical biometers. They have extraordinary repeatability and are much more precise in relative terms than measures of refractive error. And of course, in most cases, we would expect myopia progression and axial elongation to be correlated. And for the sake of this lecture, you can think about 0.1 millimeters being equivalent to maybe 0.2 or 0.25 diopters of progression. And finally, I have a strong preference for talking about efficacy in absolute terms. So I'm going to talk about efficacy in millimeters or diopters and avoid using percentages. Now, as I said before, axial length is, I think, a preferable way to look at myopia progression. And there are a number of reasons for that. I talked about disease association and visual impairment, and you can see here the data from the Dutch group on the relationship between axial elongation, age, and the risk of visual impairment. And in this very nice paper, they allowed both axial length and refractive error to compete in a statistical model. And when that happened, axial length was significant, but myopia was no longer significant. Okay, so if you just look at myopia alone, it's significantly associated with visual impairment. But if you allow it to compete with axial length wins. So there's a more strong association between axial length and visual impairment. And again, that makes sense, okay? People don't develop visual impairment and eye disease because of the thickness of their lenses. They develop it because the stretching of their eyeballs. But there's some other reasons why axial length is the metric of choice. An important one is that some of our treatments can influence the optics of the eye independently of axial length. And of course, the main example there is overnight orthokeratology, where we're flattening the cornea. We are temporarily reducing or maybe eliminating the myopia. So all of our measures of refractive error in order to assess progression are now flawed. We have to rely on axial length. And the same is true to a certain extent with atropine, because that's going to affect the accommodative apparatus of the eye. And particularly at higher concentrations, we're going to see a little bit of a hyperopic shift due to some hyperopia. So what else do we need to know? Well, as I've said before, I'm going to be talking about millimeters and diopters, and I'm not going to talk about percentages. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in the presentation. The reason being is that when you look at faster progressing children and slower progressing children, in general, the treatment effect is independent of that underlying progression rate. Now, there are some data that contradict that, but we won't go there today. But generally, when you look at children of different ages with different rates of progression, the treatment effect is consistent across those ages. And also, when you look across race, which I'm going to talk about for the next 10 or 15 minutes, the treatment effect is generally consistent across different races if you think about millimeters of diopters. If you think about percentages, it's not. Okay, so let's go on to think about some different clinical trials. And one of the challenges I alluded to is when it comes to studies of atropine, the vast majority of those studies have been conducted in the Far East, in China, Japan, Hong Kong, Singapore. There is a study from India and more recently one from Australia, which I'll talk about in a minute. The same is true when we think about these next generation spectacle lenses, these lenses that have these arrays of lenslets around the periphery of the spectacle lens, the DIMS lens, the HAL lens, or as they're marketed, the MyoSmart lens and the Stellus lens. The data we have are thus far entirely based on clinical trials in China and Hong Kong. Okay, there are ongoing studies in other parts of the world, but thus far, the only data we have published from randomized trials is from the Far East. So that's the challenge. Well, do we have data on clinical trials that have been conducted in multiple countries? Well, one excellent example, of course, is the MiSight dual focus soft lens clinical trial. And in that study, children were recruited in 4 different countries, in Canada, in the UK, in Portugal, and in Singapore. So it's somewhat rare for this to occur, but it allows the investigators to make some comparisons across different ethnicities or different nationalities. And what they concluded in their analysis, that there was the absence of significant interactions of lens type with age, sex, baseline myopia, or investigative site, demonstrates that the myopia control effect is independent of these factors. In other words, the Singaporean children progressed faster, but the slowing of their myopia associated with the MiSight lens was the same as observed in the other sites. Now, another recent paper that was published concerns a new soft lens design for myopia control being developed and evaluated by Johnson & Johnson. And the investigators here compared this new design, which is a non-coaxial ring focus design, similar underlying principles, but a different fundamental design. They're comparing that with a dual focus design, somewhat similar to the MiSight lens, and single vision lenses. They have 9 sites across Canada, the US, and China, and they reported on 185 children completing the first phase of the trial. And what's important is that about half of them were Chinese and most of the remainder were white. And as again, you might expect, based on what I've told you this morning or this evening, both axial elongation and myopia progression were faster in the Chinese subjects. But there was no race by lens interaction. In other words, race, ethnicity, nationality has no effect on the slowing of progression by these lenses. So let's go on to talk about some instances where we have a lot of data on different interventions. And one of the most studies one of the most frequently studied intervention is progressive addition lenses. So studies really began on that about 20 years ago, or began to be published about 20 years ago. And what I'm showing you here are data from the first 2 large randomized clinical trials. The one on the left was conducted on Chinese children in Hong Kong. The one on the right was a blend of ethnicities, but predominantly white children in North America. And what you can see here is in both cases, there's a small, maybe significant effect in the slowing of myopia, but it's pretty modest and pretty similar in the 2 studies. In the Hong Kong study, you've got a slowing of 0.14 diopters over 2 years. in the US study, the COMET trial, you've got a slowing of 0.2 diopters over 3 years. But you can also see in both studies, most of the slowing of myopia associated with PALs is occurring in the first year of the study. And that's really a hallmark of all studies of myopia control, certainly using optical methods. So since then, there's been a multitude of randomized clinical trials conducted. And here they are, color-coded by the location of those studies. The red bars are from Hong Kong, China, and Japan. The blue bars are all from the US. And what I'm showing you here is the one-year treatment effect. How much does the PAL or the PALs slow the progression of myopia over that first year? And you can see on average, the slow-ins may be, 0.15 diopters. But you can also see that there's no clear differences between the studies in China and Japan and Hong Kong and those conducted in the US. Now, I've also divided the studies up by whether they recruited all myopes or whether they focused on children who had either esophoria or both esophoria and an increased accommodative lag, because some people still persist in telling us that PALs work better in subjects with esophoria. That's not true based on these data. There doesn't seem to be any added benefit or added control in the subjects who have esophoria and or accommodative lag compared to myopes in general. So let's move on to something that we know works a little bit better in slowing myopia, namely overnight orthokeratology. So these were the first data published in a peer-reviewed journal almost 20 years ago now. And Pauline Cho and her colleagues in Hong Kong did a study where they recruited children who'd been fitted with overnight orthokeratology lenses and compared their rate of elongation over 2 years with a historical control group of spectacle wearing children. And what you can see is that over the 2 years, there's about a 1/4 millimeter slowing of axial elongation in the ortho-K wearing eyes. And you can also see that the majority of that effect occurs early in the study. So that wasn't a randomized clinical trial. So the researchers went back, and this time they recruited myopic children and randomized them to either wearing ortho-K or spectacles. And what did they find? Pretty much the same result. The children fitted with ortho-K were elongated much slower than those wearing spectacles. And there have been a number of studies published since then, some randomized clinical trials, but mostly not, and studies conducted in different parts of the world. So when investigators do what we call this meta-analysis here, the results seem to be remarkably consistent, regardless of whether the children are in East Asia or whether they're in other parts of the world. And they also seem to be remarkably consistent regardless of what lens type or lens design was used. So let's look at those data a little bit more closely as a function of race. So again, the red bars are the East Asian children. The blue bars are North American or European children. And again, you see the data seem to be pretty much interleaved. There's no obvious trend here in terms of the efficacy being any different in East Asia versus other parts of the world. So let's go on to talk about a third treatment modality, and that is atropine or low concentration atropine. So this was a study that was recently published in Australia, where they did have a blend of ethnicities in their population. They were looking at the efficacy of 0.01% atropine over a 2-year period. And they were able out of interest to sort of plot the treatment efficacy in different racial groups. And there's a tendency here to show that atropine is more effective in the white children than it might be in the East Asian and Southeast Asian children. But remember, the numbers here in these groups are quite small. You've only got about 10 kids in the control groups in the two Asian groups. So even though there's a blend, if you like, of ethnicities, the majority of the children are still white. So let's look at some other studies here. And what I'm showing you here are data from 6 randomized clinical trials, again, looking at the 0.01%, the treatment effect of 0.01% atropine over 1 year. And we've got 4 studies in East Asia. The 2 at the top are China, 2 at the bottom are Hong Kong and Japan. And then we've got 2 in the middle, the Australian study I just showed you, and 1 conducted in India. And again, in all studies, the efficacy of 0.01% is modest, but there doesn't, again, seem to be any systematic difference between the progression of or the control of myopia in the East Asian subjects and in other parts of the world. So 3 different interventions showing that there's no difference between East Asian children and Asian children. One intervention where we perhaps do see a little bit of a difference, and this is data on pirenzepine, which is a selective muscarinic antagonist. So it's like a designer atropine, if you like. It should selectively affect the muscarinic receptors in the retina while leaving those in the ciliary muscle and the iris relatively unaffected. And in terms of axial elongation, the study that was conducted in East Asia showed a bigger treatment effect than that in North America. When you look at myopia progression, the difference is much more modest. The slowing of progression was much more similar in the 2 groups over a 1 year. So, bringing that all together, we previously published this paper where we make, I think, a compelling case that absolute treatment is constant across age. And the reason for that, of course, is it's all about the underlying progression rate. So let me show you some data from that paper. So these are data from a soft lens myopia control lens that was never commercialized. And what I'm showing you here, the green dots are the control eyes, the blue dots are the eyes wearing the experimental soft lens. And what you can see here, when we fit lines to the 6 month and the 12 months data, those lines tend to be pretty much parallel. In other words, the control group is progressing faster, but the slowing due to the myopia control soft lens, the treatment effect is pretty much the same across the range of ages. And if you were to sort of say, well, what about the percentages? You'll see that the percentages are very different. So if you've got younger children, the percentage control rate is lower. Older children, it's much higher. But if you think about millimeters or diopters, the treatment effect is consistent. Here we've got data from one of the studies I showed you previously on overnight orthokeratology. And again, we fit exponential lines to the control data and ortho-K eyes. And again, what you can see, the increase in axial length slows the older the children are. Okay, so the rate of progression is much faster in the younger children, but those lines are parallel. The treatment effect in millimeters here is the same across ages. And one final example, which is close to CooperVision's heart, is from the MySight clinical trial. So again, what we're showing you here are the refractive error change in the 5 different ages in the MySight trial. At the top, the open symbols are the control, the MiSight eyes. The symbols down the bottom are the single vision wearing lenses. And you can see that, again, if you fit some lines through those data, the lines are remarkably parallel. If you go about it a different way, I've plotted 5 arrows here, vertical arrows, which have the same length. You can again see that certainly in the 9 to 12-year-olds, the treatment effect is remarkably consistent across age, slightly different in a small group of 8-year-olds. So we've shown that underlying progression, which varies with age, is a good way to look at myopia control effects. So the question is, we've plotted data as a function of age. Could we do the same? Would we expect the same for race? So let's go back to the graph I showed you earlier. We're looking here at the average axial elongation as a function of age and race. And we can pick 2 different groups of children. We can look at the 9-year-olds who are not East Asian and compare them with the 11-year-olds. We would expect on average that those children would progress or elongate at the same rate. So given the fact we believe that the myopia control effect is independent of underlying progression, we could expect the absolute treatment to be constant across different races in the same way as it is across different ages, because it's all about the underlying progression rate. The treatment effect is independent of that underlying progression rate, whether that underlying progression rate varies due to age or due to race. So we've now got another similarity, I believe, between results on East Asian children and results in other parts of the world. The treatment efficacy is really independent of race, and the treatment efficacy is independent because it's independent of the underlying progression rate. So in closing, if we go back to my original question, can I extrapolate myopia control efficacy from myopia control efficacy results from East Asia to the patients that I see? I think the answer is a resounding yes. We've looked at studies, a couple of studies, the MiSight trial and then the ring focus contact lens study, where there were multiple countries involved, and the treatment effect seems to be the same. We've looked at 3 different treatment modalities and looked at the efficacy in East Asian children and in other children. And again, the efficacy seems to be the same. And then we've sort of made an argument that, well, if the underlying, it doesn't matter what the underlying progression is and whether it differs due to age or differs due to race, we would intuitively expect the treatment efficacy to be consistent. So I want to thank you for your time today. We will have time for a few questions in a minute. But in the meantime, I am going to stop sharing my screen and turn the floor over to Dr. Timmerman, who's going to talk to you about some MiSight data, which will be interesting.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Bullimore, for that wonderful, fully evidence-based presentation. So you have taken all the papers which are out there in the literature and made life easy for us. So we can just look at your presentation and talk and get all the evidence which is there. And thank you for including all the latest evidence as well. The Australia paper we just recently published, and that's really important to look at it. To the attendees, if you have any questions, please put it up on the chat. We would take some questions in a couple of minutes. But before that, I would like to hand over to Dr. Timmerman, who is currently with Cooper Vision as the manager of myopia management. She has earned her optometry degree with honors from the Illinois College of Optometry and has also completed a residency in pediatric optometry. She also holds a Master of Science in Global Health from the Northwestern University. She has always been interested in pediatrics, if I believe. And with that, she has also been working very closely with a pediatric ophthalmologist at various centers. And that has led to her interest in myopia management. So she's going to take us through about the MySight lenses and the results for the 7 years research. So, Dr. Timmerman, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you so much, Dr. Bullimore, as well. That was such an interesting presentation and talk today. So I know myself, I learned a lot. So I hope I can share a little bit more too about the MySight 7-year study, as well as just a little bit more information overall and the importance of managing myopia in children and the difference that we all can make. So as mentioned in Dr. Bullimore's lecture, by 2050, 50% of the global population is anticipated to have myopia. So that tells us right now that there's a significant portion of the population, and as you can see from the earlier presentation, that there is this distribution globally of this condition, but that's only going to continue to rise with time. So we know that there's a responsibility and an importance to really address this condition, because we know that there's a lot of opportunities that we can do to slow down that progression and address this. So where can we make the difference? And that's really with our children, because that's where we're seeing the onset, the progression, and that's where our treatments are really having an impact. So our colleagues in Southern California looked at what was the prevalence of myopia in children, and from over 61,000 eye exams, what they were able to determine is really where that kind of percentage is in that pediatric population. And as you can see from this graph here, we're already seeing onset at that early age of 5 to 7 years old. That's our kindergartners to second graders, so very young. So if you really just think about that impact and what it's having on their lifestyle, their learning, and just their overall how they're interacting in their environment. And as those children continue to age, we see that the prevalence just continues to increase. And one thing that was really interesting to note is that we see that about 1 in 4, so 25% of those children in the teenage years had 3 diopters or more. So if you think about that from just a visual quality, both uncorrected and even corrected, that is going to have an impact on their overall lifestyle. And just momentarily, we're going to talk about that from an ocular health risk standpoint as well. So my colleague, Dr. Justin Kwan, who's on CooperVision as well and helps lead the myopia management team, he was part of this great study that looked at the 2020 US consensus to see, again, what is that overall prevalence? And what they found is that if we take all the eye care professionals, both optometrists as well as ophthalmologists here in the US, which is about 70,000, it will require that each eye care professional sees just under 300 children with myopia per year in order to effectively address this condition. So again, that tells us that there's a huge prevalence of this in our pediatric population, but a big opportunity to do a lot of good and to address this. So without further ado, kind of talking back, let's see. There we go. They are having a mind of its own here today. Let's see. There we go. There's a graph I'm looking for. So going back to that -3 diopter number, why is that so important? And as you can see from this graph here is that the overall risk of developing some of those complications related to myopia, so myopic maculopathy, glaucoma development, retinal detachment, and of course, early onset cataracts, that increases is exponential at that -3 level. So what we really like to instill is that let's try to keep these children under that -3 level and get them through high school below that level, because we know that it can have a significant impact overall in their quality of life and then ocular health risk later on, but also just from a visual quality standpoint as well. And at CooperVision, we're really proud of the portfolio that we built to really address myopia management in children. So as you can see here, there's a portfolio of companies that are under CooperVision that encompasses our soft contact lenses, but also our orthokeratology portfolio, which is our CRT Paragon lenses, as well as IC lenses with GP specialists. And then looking at our products too, we're going to talk a little bit more about that FDA-approved one-day contact lens MiSight. So getting into this a little bit more, as mentioned, there is a 7-year rigorous study that really gives that overall support of this lens and how we can confidently and comfortably fit children and know that we can slow that overall progression. So because of that rigorous study that it went through to get that FDA approval, it does get the indication of myopia control. Now, because we want to make sure to address this condition in all children, some of them may not be a candidate for this lens. So we do have other options, which Dr. Mark Bullimore did go through here with you guys today, which is our atropine, so the pharmaceuticals, as well as some other contact lens options in order to really slow down the overall myopia. So what is MiSight? So it's a little bit different than what you guys may be used to in regards to multifocal contact lenses or those presbyopic contact lenses that we're utilizing for patients that need correction for both distance and near simultaneously. This is actually built for slowing the progression of myopia. So it's a dual focus contact lens. So this illustration really demonstrates how that contact lens is designed, how the MiSight lens is designed. So from these lighter kind of pink, lighter purple colors here, this is the correcting zone. This allows the child to see everything clearly in their daily world, just as they would be seen in spectacles, as well as single vision contact lenses. And as you can see from these darker concentric rings here in the mid and outer periphery, that's the treatment zone. And what that treatment zone includes is it puts the eye in a 2-diopter myopic defocus. What that means is that it's moving those light rays just in front of the retina or that tissue that lines the back of the eye. And that's really that treatment effect in order to slow the progression of myopia and that axial elongation. So again, MiSight has gone through a 7-year rigorous study. So what it first included was a 3-year randomized controlled study where it was children 8 to 12 years old that were randomized to either the MiSight lens or the control lens of ProClear one day. And what we found in those first 3 years of wear with those children 8 to 12 years old, where we know that with that onset, it's going to be a lot faster, that we were able to slow that refractive error by 59%. And axial elongation by 52%. So what we did is that we continued the study on for an additional 3 years after. And ethically, we couldn't keep those children in that control lens any longer because we knew we could have a significant impact overall in that myopia progression. So what we did is we continued to monitor those children that were originally fit in the MiSight lenses for an additional 3 years. So overall, they were wearing them for 6 years. And then those children wearing the ProClear were then switched over to MiSight. And we got some great data from that. And from what we found is that those children that continued to wear MiSight continued to have the same slowing effect of their myopia progression. So we didn't see any adaptation period at all during those 6 years of wear. Additionally, from those children that were switched over from ProClear, the control lens, to MiSight, also had a slowing of progression that mimicked those that were originally wearing MiSight. So this was great news because that tells us that if we're catching these children a little bit later in their myopia journey, that we can still have a significant impact overall in slowing that progression. And then it was the 7th year. So this was the year where we took all the children out of the MiSight lens to really see if there was going to be any rebound effect. What would happen to that myopia after they discontinued wear? And the good news is that we saw that we retained all of those benefits. So all of that work of wearing those contact lenses were obtained after discontinuing wear, that we didn't see these children have a rebound effect, meaning did that eye all of a sudden exponentially grow to where it naturally would have been based on genetics or just where it would have naturally progressed to without any intervention. So again, that gives us a lot of confidence and comfort when prescribing this contact lens, because we know we can have a significant impact and that it's going to be retained after discontinuing the wear. So again, this is just an overall summary of that first 3 years, that randomized controlled study where the children were 8 to 12 years old of wearing the MiSight lenses. So it's 59% reduction of the refractive error, 52 of slowing the progression of axial length. And the great news is just under half, 41% of those children wearing MiSight for a period of 3 years show no progression at all. So no meaningful progression of their myopia. So basically it halted. Though we can never guarantee to stop myopia progression, the great news is that these children, 41%, didn't show any meaningful progression during that 8 to 12 years old. So this is a great quote here, because many times when we think about intervening with myopia management products, you know, do we start it right away? Do we wait to see, are these children progressing with myopia profile? Agreed that myopia management should be initiated when myopia is apparent, regardless of prior progression, rather than waiting to assess the progression rate. Because we know we can't turn back that time, and that myopia can only get worse. So why wait? The time is now, because we know that we can have a significant impact in slowing that progression. And, you know, why wait to see if these children are progressing? Because all of them are a candidate for intervention. And with Cooper Vision, we're really proud of the resources that we have available to really educate our patients and parents on myopia, as well as for our providers to learn more too. So I would really encourage you all to subscribe to our YouTube channel. We have testimonials from both doctors as well as patients and parents, and also some great resources. One that I love the most is that we have Violet, who is a child, and she goes through the insertion and removal process of her contact lenses, of her MiSight contact lenses. And why this is so important is because that really instills that overall confidence in patients and parents when they can see one of their peers being able to successfully do that independently on their own. So again, MiSight is the first and only FDA-approved product to slow the progression of myopia in children. So I thank you all so much for taking time out of your day to learn more, because that allows us to do more. And again, thank you for everyone as part of the OOLS program, as well as Dr. Bullimore for sharing all this wisdom with us today.
Well, thank you, Dr. Timmerman, for sharing that. And thank you so much, Cooper Vision, for your support and, you know, taking us through your study data. So we have Professor Bullimore back, and there we go. Yeah. So there were a couple of questions which came in. I'm just going to take the first one, which kind of ranked the treatment options for myopia control. I just put this question. This was more like a comment, but I thought you might be able to kind of give us your thoughts and more of the evidence-based knowledge on this. Yeah.
So I get asked this question a lot. People say, well, which is the best treatment? And that's us, like asking a mother which of her children she loves the most. Because I work with companies that work with, or, you know, in all of the produce all of these different options. My usual answer is to say, you know, which treatment do you recommend for a child? My answer is the one that suits their lifestyle and the one that they're going to use, because none of these treatments will work unless the child is compliant. So there's no point in prescribing drops if they're not going to put them in every night. There's no point in giving them spectacles if they're not going to wear them. There's no point in giving them ortho K lenses if they're not going to put them in every night. So it all very much depends on compliance. I would say that overall you can get very similar myopia control effect with all of these. The one that is, I would put an asterisk next to, is atropine, because if you prescribe atropine at 1%, that's probably one of the very most effective ways of slowing myopia. Now, the child's going to be debilitated and need photochromic multifocal spectacles so they can actually see up close. And there's always a potential of a little bit of rebound once the atropine is stopped. On the other hand, atropine at lower concentrations seems to be less effective, as I showed you, than overnight ortho K and also MiSight lenses. So I think, again, you can achieve really good results with any of these options, but it's a matter of matching the treatment to the child's lifestyle and also making sure that they are going to be compliant.
Well, right. That's very important. Compliance is really the key, right? Yeah. The other question is, we did talk about different race and other parts of the world as well, but any thoughts over somebody is joining us from Africa, so any concise randomized clinical trials from Africa, which comes off? I know you will say recommended reading, there will be some papers, but just about that, yeah.
No, I mean, medical research in general and clinical trials tends to be underrepresented in the African continent. And yeah, there are a multitude of reasons for that. Probably the best data we have on Africans is on African Americans. So there were, in the CLEAR study, there was some African American children specifically recruited, and in the COMET trial, there were some African Americans recruited. So we can draw some conclusions, but it's the one ethnic group that I'm reluctant to sort of extrapolate on. We do know African American children, their myopia stabilizes sooner than other ethnicities in North America. We also know that they end up with slightly less myopia than their white and Asian American peers. But we really don't have a lot of data or much data at all on any types of interventions for myopia in Africa. But that's a great question. So if you're practicing there, you have to fly a little bit by the seat of your pants.
All right, great. And the other question is in terms of the duration. So what is the recommended, or how long should be the child in myopia management program when they start showing some stability? And does this vary across different modes of management, if there is something on that sort?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be in this for the long haul. There's some nonsensical statements that have been made. It's like, well, you put a child on atropine for 2 years, then you take them off and see whether they progress or not. Okay, if they're still relatively young, they're going to progress. Okay, what we do know from the COMET study is that the average age of stabilization is around 15 years. Okay, but what that means is that half the children are still progressing beyond 15 years of age, and actually a quarter of them are still progressing significantly at the age of 18. So we have to really manage the individual child and make regular assessments of their axial elongation preferably, but also the refractive error if possible, and see when stabilization has occurred. But if the treatment is working and being well tolerated, then keep the child, in the MiSight lenses, keep them in the ortho K, keep them on atropine, keep them in the myopia control spectacles as long as possible, and they'll get the maximum benefit because, as Dr. Timmerman said, there's certainly an accrued benefit in that sort of years 4 to 6 in the MiSight trial. So the children were recruited at an average age of 10, and then for the second phase, they were 13 to 16. So there's still an added benefit taking them through their teenage years. And if they're still tolerating the lenses, then that's fine. Do you contemplate changing them to a single vision option at one stage, or maybe even changing them to a different modality? Yeah. Okay. There's going to be a continuum of care. We may see where we start children in spectacles, move them onto soft lenses or ortho K, and if they're progressing too quickly, add atropine to the mix. Okay, but I said it to, see what's available to you in your own setting, and do the best for the individual child.
Well, great. And I think we take one last question here. I did remember seeing your slides that you made recommendations of having cycloplegic refraction, for refraction measurements. Anything in terms of axial length? What's the reliable tool which has been probably used maximum, and according to your thoughts, a reliable tool for measuring axial length and the follow-up for myopia progression?
Well, there's a whole host of instruments out there. I mean, the original one was the IOL Master, then the Lenstar came along, and then there's a whole host of second generation versions of the IOL Master and other instruments that have been developed. All of them rely on either partial coherence interferometry or OCT technology to measure the length of the eye. And they're all, I would say, very similar in their performance in terms of their precision, their repeatability. So I don't have a favorite one. There are new instruments that have been introduced that are a little bit more accessible in terms of cost, but also include some myopia management software in there. So they're, unlike the original instruments, which were marketed for the cataract surgeon, measuring axial length to determine intraocular lens power. The newer instruments, and there are a range of them which I won't name, but some of them have myopia in the title. They are specifically designed to do a few things well, specifically measure axial length, but some of them measure corneal topography, some of them also measure refractive error, but all of them, these new instruments, are focused on myopia control and give you some added tools in there. So as long as you're using some sort of optical biometer and not ultrasound, then I think you're in good shape. Now, of course, not everybody has those instruments. They may be, too expensive to justify initially. But at the same time, if you are using spectacles and contact lenses, soft contact lenses, certainly refractive error measurement is adequate to get you going, and you shouldn't wait until you've got an axial length measuring device before you start doing myopia management. You just need to get started right away.
Thank you so much, Professor Mark, for that wonderful talk, and thank you, Dr. Timmerman, for joining us today and sharing the results. We have taken most of the questions which popped up on the chat. With that, thank you everyone for attending. We do have a session planned next weekend. Until then, take care, be safe, and see you next week. Thank you and bye-bye. Thanks, Rob. Thanks, Dr. Timmerman.